I think there will be changes in the power sector that will be significant. We're seeing them especially with respect to the advances in distributed generation. Large climatic events are making people want to have more control of their systems. We're also seeing it in the area of the level of load growth. Load growth is decreasing substantially as it has over the last number of decades, and I think this is primarily because we're seeing more advances in data mining and in energy data and the ability to go in and do deeper dives in energy efficiency. We're seeing people starting to receive payments for things like demand response, changing their loads at different times, and all this is reducing the amount of energy that's being used overall and also reducing the amount of energy being used on peak. So those two things are driving huge changes in the utility sector because the utilities are seeing their overall revenues go down from a standpoint of both distributed generation and energy efficiency impacting them. These two new events, that is the reduction in loads or load growth and also the advent of more distributed generation like solar PV, disrupts the utility model because the utilities depend upon primarily selling more electricity, or even those areas they have decoupling where they're not depending upon selling more electricity. They depend upon increasing their profits through investing more in their plant. And so if they can't sell more and therefore invest in more power plants, ultimately their financial models are not going to succeed. And so that's one huge issue for them. Another one is, especially with distributed generation like solar photovoltaics, when the customer installs that technology and they reduce the amount of kilowatt hours that they're taking from the utility, oftentimes the utility is recovering a great portion of its fixed costs from those variable kilowatt hours. And if they're not consuming more of them and paying the utility for them, then the utility is not recovering their fixed costs. And so by not recovering their fixed costs, they're really in what's a classic death spiral where they can't continue to support their rate base and they can't continue to support the need to provide service to their customers. Utilities need to very carefully consider what their rate designs are. I mean, I know that EEI has suggested that utilities look at rate designs, especially the net metering rate designs. On the other hand, though, from a standpoint of distributed generation, I think there are a number of people that are promoting those technologies that would claim that there's a lot of benefits from distributed generation. So utilities need to figure out how they can ultimately protect their overall revenue structure, and that may entail them changing their business model entirely. They may have to go to business models where they're looking at providing other services to customers that they're not now providing them, services such as additional storage for the customer to even out peak loads, or even things like going into distributed generation themselves. So utilities are going to have to look at what their options are and how those options fit into potentially new business models for them. Well, I think the job of regulators is to ensure that customers have choice and that customers have availability and access to affordable and reliable and environmentally sustainable energy. If the regulators can do that through a proper market structure, and that market structure then changes the utility model so that the utilities ultimately are much different than they are now. They may be selling different products and they may be doing things, and there may be other third parties that come into the system that provide services to consumers that weren't provided before. That potentially can be a good thing as long as consumers, again, have choice, and that choice provides them access to reasonably priced energy that can be sustainable and reliable. From a standpoint of the future of the grid and the future of the utility system from a physical standpoint, I think we're seeing a substantial reduction in the amount of additional central station generation. I think we're going to continue to see that for a number of reasons. Some which I've mentioned earlier, include the increased energy efficiency overall in the system that consumers are achieving with the various techniques. The other is, of course, distributed generation as well. And I think that distributed generation is going to go across not only the technologies that we've seen recently, which include solar PV, but I think we're going to see an increase in distributed generation fueled by conventional fuels such as natural gas. I think we're going to see more combined heat and power. I think we're going to see more microturbine and even reciprocating engine systems that will in fact be installed in consumer facilities, commercial, and perhaps even all the way down to residential facilities. I think there's a number of reasons for this. Number one, consumers want control. Number two, we're seeing a number of climactic weather events where consumers are concerned about the ability to ensure that they have reliable power. And the third one, I think, is we're seeing evidence of the fact that the central station grid, concentric to large station power plants, whether they be conventionally fueled with fossil fuels or whether they even be renewable, such as wind and solar, based upon a grid system that is dependent upon a number of nodes of high voltage transmission lines and, most importantly, high voltage substations, is not sustainable from a physical security standpoint. I don't believe that we can continue to secure the grid, and we've already seen some instances of this happening. There's some studies that show how vulnerable those nodes are on the grid, and if you combine those things together, I think all three of the things that I mentioned are going to drive consumers to want to have more localized generation, more generation at their local level. And they're also, of course, going to want to do things to save money, which means driving more energy efficiency. And we're seeing a lot of software companies now come into the grid space with new, very sophisticated data mining programs to be able to look at the ways for consumers to go deeper into efficiency. So those things combined, I think, are going to be tremendously powerful in change actors for the grid. On the demand side, you're going to see more and more demand-capable technologies. One of the technologies that I think you're going to see, in addition to software that I've discussed, is you're also going to see definitely storage. And there's a number of companies that are developing not utility scale, but rather consumer scale storage that will, I think, be cost effective to allow consumers to do things like put in a solar PV system and utilize that PV system for ultimately their entire load requirements. And there'll be use of those storage systems to do other things like ultimately flatten out the load profile of a customer to reduce their demand charges on a monthly basis. And in fact, there's companies that are doing that right now. There's one in San Francisco called STEM that's has that as a business model, utilizing storage to ultimately help consumers even out their demands. Then we're seeing demand response being used, of course, on an ever wider scale at the wholesale level, and that's been a great success in PJM, the Mid-Atlantic grid area. They're using demand response to actually take up about 10% of their capacity requirements and meet 10% of those capacity requirements with demand response. That's very significant. If you multiplied that across the country, it would have a huge impact, again, on lowering the amount of central station generation, specifically peakers, that would be required to meet loads. And so we're going to see that happen as well because it's so cost effective and it puts money directly in the pockets of consumers rather than having them pay money out to finance these peaking units that utilities have been putting in place. Well, another big issue we're going to see in the future of the grid is the need for flexibility. And that flexibility is going to be required because we're seeing larger and larger amounts of renewables, of variable resources like wind and solar being put on the grid. And so as they're put on the grid, we're going to have strategies to make the grid more flexible. And ultimately those strategies entail a number of different technologies. Storage and distributed generation are all technologies that can play into flexibility, as is demand response as well. Or at the conventional level, central station combustion turbines that are more flexible are being built by some companies like GE. But all these technologies are going to be extremely important to advance that flexibility. And again, another reason why I think we're going to move away from more traditional, less flexible technologies like coal and nuclear plants, primarily because that flexibility is essential to continuing reliability of the grid. And some studies have recently been done by a group in Washington, D.C. that demonstrates from a base case standpoint, if you have inflexible resources and continue to put on renewable resources on the grid, it's going to actually cost more for consumers than if you put flexible resources into that grid. So you can actually lower costs and at the same time put in more renewables by having more flexible resources as part of that grid system.